All right, so picking back up here. So again, here in the north, you've got occupied France. That's where the Germans and the Nazis actually were. And in the south, that's the quote unquote free area where Vichy Pétain was staging his government. All right, so across the channel in Great Britain, Hitler turned his attention to what he called Operation Sea Lion. His plan was to crush the British so that they could pose no threat to his eventual takeover of all of Europe. So Winston Churchill had recently replaced Neville Chamberlain, who we learned about last chapter. He was the guy who gave in to Hitler and essentially gave him exactly what he wanted. Churchill was of a totally different school of thought. His plan was to never surrender, to fight back as strongly and as long as the British people could possibly do. So Hitler's plan was to destroy the RAF, which is the Royal Air Force, and bomb the British people until they sued for peace. What it means to sue for peace is you bring the pain and the punishment to the individual civilians, and they will have to get their government to give up the fight. So the British were able to sustain themselves with new radar technology. That was something altogether new. They were able to actually see when the Germans were coming. A code-breaking machine called the Enigma. There was a pretty famous movie that came out last year. If you get a chance to watch it, I'm pretty sure it's on Netflix about that. And then finally, their sheer will and determination. I know that sounds kind of corny, especially from a historian, but we'll talk about this in a second in terms of what the government was able to do through propaganda to get their people to fight back. So Hitler revealed more of his hubris here and ultimately gave up his attacks in May of 1941. So a couple cool images to look at. Here, this is the aftermath of a German bombing campaign. This giant crater here where this bus just jumped right into the front of it is pretty incredible. Here you've got a British police officer escorting a child across a road. And sometimes, of course, when the Germans dropped their bombs, they wouldn't explode, so they'd be left here in the aftermath. So I like these images down here at left. These showcase the very simple but very effective British nationalistic propaganda techniques that were used. This one here in the red, of course, is turned into a couple annoying T-shirts that people wear today. But in World War II, it was a way for the Queen and for the Prime Minister to get their people together and not just give up as the Germans berated them every night with their bombing campaigns. Here's a group of kids returning to their home. Typically, the British would bomb at night, the Germans would bomb at night, which was considered against Geneva Convention because you couldn't tell where you were bombing and you could hit innocent civilians, but that played right into the Germans' technique. So a lot of British people would go at night into raid shelters and come out in the morning hoping that their homes and businesses would still be there. And in this case, these kids came home when there was nothing there. I like this political cartoon. Showcases Hitler as a dentist, and you see all the different hats here of the people who have apparently been in to see him. So he's come out and he's here to get the teeth extracted. I'm not sure what the metaphor is there with the teeth of the British, and apparently the British are willing and able to fight back. All right, so with his capture of Poland and a lot of the eastern areas of Europe and his failures in Great Britain, Hitler had to turn his attention to what his comrade, Mussolini, he would probably be so bummed if he heard me say comrade, what his ally Mussolini had done in North Africa. Mussolini, trying to keep up with his fascist bro, invaded parts of northern Africa, specifically controlled by the British. The most important area he went after was the Suez Canal. We've discussed just how important that is for oil routes and trading shipping techniques. So it was ultimately a disaster, and Hitler had to rush in and bail him out. His most famous general in this region was a guy named Erwin Rommel, otherwise known as the Desert Fox. He was able to actually come in and shore up what the Italians had really messed up. But from there, Hitler jumped onto the Balkans and tried to capture Yugoslavia and Greece, which he did. And he used this as a staging ground for the next step of his plan, which was to invade the Soviet Union. I love this picture here on the left. This is a group of German soldiers raising the swastika over the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. And then on the right, this is Erwin Rommel, who will come up a little bit later. His death story is really fascinating and really emblematic of what the Nazi machine was able to accomplish. All right, so from these, we've been talking about this 360-degree invasion. If you'll remember, the Germans had agreed to, and they signed it, so they really did agree to this, a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. But wouldn't you know it, Hitler was untrustworthy and went back on his word. I love this image here on the right. This is an invading German soldier who has toppled a statue of Joseph Stalin and is sitting atop him while chugging a bottle of, you would presume, Russian vodka. So Hitler's hubris was made fully known in the USSR. He called it Operation Barbarossa, which paid homage to the last German war leader to invade the USSR, to invade Russia previously. So the Soviets were not prepared. Stalin had been warned time and time again. Even Winston Churchill had reached out to Stalin and said, hey, your supposed friend, Adolf Hitler, is going to invade you. He's going to double cross you. And Stalin insisted that that would never be the case. So he never did anything to shore up his forces. And ultimately, they paid the prices for it. When the Germans first invaded, they crushed the Soviets. Most famously, Stalin actually holed himself up in his quarters for about 3 days. He would not leave his bed, not even to use the restroom, according to some documents. But whatever the case was, the Soviets actually were able to mount a pretty significant resistance campaign. Their most famous strategy was, as opposed to slash and burn and just keep retreating further and further into Russia, they got as close as they could to the German lines. It was called hugging the lines. So every time the German bombers came in to bomb the Soviets, they would also kill Germans. It was a suicide technique, but it was highly effective. They also had very early examples of urban warfare, fighting from street to street, most famously in Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad lasted almost 3 years, and some historians estimate that maybe as many as 4.5 million casualties, I should say, not just civilians, but casualties were lost during that epic siege. But whatever the case was, Hitler again revealed his hubris here by ordering his generals to never surrender, even when it would have made sense to do so. So here's a couple images of Soviet soldiers preparing to fight back against the Germans. Like Napoleon before him, the Germans were unprepared to fight a winter campaign. Here's Hitler's second in command, Heinrich Himmler. He'll be coming up a lot later in this chapter, perhaps even more evil than Hitler himself. He's inspecting a Soviet POW camp here. And here's an image. These are Red Army soldiers as they're being marched into that POW camp. All right, so towards the end of this period, the Americans are getting pulled further and further towards getting involved with this war. Many Americans were very weary of this. They wanted to avoid war at all cost. Roosevelt feared that if the Allies failed, the U.S. would be pulled into the fight absolutely. So what he did was he convinced Congress to pass a peacetime draft. He also convinced Congress to pass what was called the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed us as Americans to lend and lease ammunitions, even sometimes money, to the Allied forces while still maintaining some semblance of neutrality. So here's a good political cartoon showcasing kind of the flaws in that. And this, of course, is our friend Dr. Seuss. The policy was that Americans would bring out the planes, guns, whatever it would be, about 2/3 of the way to England, and from there, England would have to pick it up. So therefore, we weren't be physically giving it to them from our ports or getting it to their ports. It was supposed to, again, maintain that neutrality. But the pie chart at right shows just how influential our aid giving was to the Allied campaign. All right, so here's a couple quick final thoughts. Hitler was what we would call a megalomaniac. Megalomania is a type of mental disorder that leads you to believe that you're perfect, omniscient, which means you know everything. And therefore, he was unable to take the warnings of his people, some of his seconds in command. And ultimately, when we get to the end of this chapter, we'll look at why his campaign failed, but just how dangerously close he got to conquering all of Europe. And hopefully we can learn some lessons about current megalomanias, and there are absolutely some that control certain countries around the world. So the other thing to consider is that the Allies themselves actually had to form an alliance with Stalin, who was, of course, another megalomaniac. And that's going to lead to the last chapter that we discussed this year when we talk about the Cold War. So I like the quote just to end on from Winston Churchill, who we introduced this chapter. A lie gets halfway around